That day felt like standing on the edge of something final. Everyone thought Freddie was the fragile one, but the truth is, I was the one who nearly ruined everything. And Freddie, he saved me without anyone ever noticing.
It's a confession he held onto for decades, a secret tied to a moment the world celebrates as rock's greatest resurrection. July 13th, 1985. The day Queen stepped on stage at Live Aid, broken, frightened, uncertain, and walked off as legends. But what happened during those 20 minutes? What Brian finally admits now is a truth almost no one has ever heard. And to understand it, we have to go back to the moment when Queen were not immortal. They were hanging by a thread. Before Live Aid, Queen weren't a titan standing tall. They were a giant slowly collapsing under its own weight. Their last album had disappointed critics. Their tour momentum had stalled. American popularity had dipped sharply. And their decision to perform in South Africa had turned the press against them completely. But the worst fracture wasn't external. It was internal. Freddie had gone solo. Brian was exhausted. Roger was frustrated. John had withdrawn emotionally. The band that had once finished each other's sentences could now barely hold a polite conversation. When Bob Geldof began forming the Live Aid lineup, Queen weren't even on his list. "They've peaked," he reportedly said. "They're done." Only promoter Harvey Goldsmith disagreed. He had seen Queen command stadiums like no one else. He believed they had a spark left, something raw, something dangerous. After weeks of uncertainty, the band quietly agreed to perform. Not out of excitement, not even confidence, but because deep down, even if they'd never admit it, they all needed one more chance to feel like Queen. Brian later explained, "We weren't looking for redemption. We just wanted to feel like a band again, even if only for 20 minutes. They had no idea those 20 minutes would become the most important performance of their lives. But even then, Brian sensed something was off. Something that would come back to haunt him later. When Queen entered the rehearsal studio, it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like four men stepping into neutral territory. Careful, guarded, polite. Freddie was distant. Roger kept to himself. John barely spoke. And Brian tried desperately to dissolve the tension, cracking jokes that fell flat. They played the first songs like strangers covering Queen. But music has a strange way of revealing the truth long before words do. During a run-through of Bohemian Rhapsody, Freddie hit a note he hadn't reached cleanly in months. It rang through the room with a force that made everyone look up at once. Roger grinned. John nodded slowly. And Brian felt that old electricity buzz through his fingertips. The real Freddie was back, Brian recalled later. It was like lightning coming alive again. But underneath the joy, Brian noticed something subtle. Something Freddie tried to hide. A faint tremor in his hand. A moment of breathlessness between lines. A flicker of pain behind the eyes. Freddie laughed it off, pushing through each rehearsal with fierce determination, even when his voice cracked or his energy dipped. But Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Still, those rehearsals awakened a Fire Queen thought they'd lost forever. By the third day, the room was alive. Laughing, shouting, creating. It felt like the beginning of another era. But the unease Brian felt, the one tied to Freddie's condition, grew stronger. And he later admitted he considered canceling the performance. Freddie told him, "Darling, if I'm going out singing." And the decision was sealed. The sun rose over Wembley with a quiet kind of chaos. Technicians sprinted across the arena, cables tangled like vines, the air thick with tension. But inside Queen's trailer, silence reigned. Freddie sat curled into a white robe, staring at a cup of tea he could barely swallow. His throat was worse than usual, raw, strained, fighting him at every note. He'd seen the doctor that morning. The warning had been blunt. "You should not sing today." But Freddie had already decided he would. Brian watched from across the room, noticing something no one else seemed to catch. Freddie's hands were trembling. Roger tuned his snare slowly, refusing to look up. John strummed his bass absent-mindedly, lost in his own quiet worry. Brian walked to the small window, staring at the massive stage in the distance. Years later, he confessed, "I thought that day might break Freddie, but I also feared it might break us." Outside, thousands of fans were filling the stadium, laughing, shouting, chanting Queen's name. None of them knew the truth unfolding behind the curtain. Then Freddie stood. He slipped into his white tank top and studded armband. He straightened his posture. He forced a grin. "Let's give them what they came for," he said gently. The door opened. 4 silhouettes stepped out into the corridor, walking toward the light. And Brian felt a sinking realization. If something went wrong today, it would be the end, not just of the show, but of Queen. What he didn't know was that the real danger waiting for them on stage had nothing to do with Freddie's voice. When Queen walked into the sunlight, the stadium barely noticed. It was still mid-afternoon. The crowd was restless, distracted, buzzing from the previous acts. No fireworks, no light show, no grand stage entrance. Just Freddie moving toward the piano, John settling beside his bass, Roger behind the drums, and Brian gripping the red special like a lifeline. And then, the first chord of Bohemian Rhapsody split the air. It wasn't just a chord, it was a declaration. Freddie's voice, still rough from the morning, cut through the noise with a force that silenced the stadium. Tens of thousands of people froze. Energy shifted. A ripple of electricity moved from the stage to the crowd like a shockwave. Cameras zoomed in. Faces lit up. The restless roaring turned into thunderous unity. Within seconds, Queen weren't reclaiming their place. They were rewriting history. But on stage, Brian's eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on Freddie. He saw the wince during a high note, the subtle tightening of Freddie's jaw, the way he steadied himself on the piano bench. Brian felt fear prick behind his ribs. Still, the band pushed forward, locking together in perfect rhythm. The audience saw perfection. Brian saw danger. And halfway through the set, something happened that confirmed his fear. Freddie's energy surged. Too much energy, too quickly. That was when the real problem began. By Radio Gaga, Freddie was unstoppable. He clapped above his head. The crowd clapped back. Tens of thousands of hands moving in perfect rhythm. It wasn't a performance anymore. It was communion. From the outside, Freddie looked invincible. But Brian saw the truth up close. Sweat dripping faster than it should. A slight shake in Freddie's left arm. A fleeting grimace between smiles. Freddie was burning through everything he had. Roger later said, it was like he'd plugged himself into a lightning bolt. But Brian understood. This level of energy had a cost. When Hammer to Fall unleashed its opening riff, Freddie bounced across the stage like a man who'd never known fear. But Brian noticed something the crowd didn't. Freddie stumbled. Just a half step, just a moment. But enough for Brian's heart to stop. Freddie recovered instantly, spinning into the next lyric like nothing happened. The cameras never caught it. The audience never saw it. Even Roger and John missed it. But Brian saw everything. He thought, he's pushing past his limits. This isn't sustainable. And still, Freddie kept going. Louder, braver, brighter. Somewhere between fear and awe, Brian realized something horrifying. Freddie wasn't performing for the world. He was performing for them, for the band he loved. It was heroic and terrifying. But the real danger wasn't Freddie's physical state. It was something happening behind Brian's amplifier, something the world never saw, and the secret Brian kept hidden for decades. Midway through the set, as Hammer to Fall thundered across Wembley, Brian felt a sudden shift behind him. A pop, a crackle, a faint electrical buzz that sent a chill up his spine. He turned slightly, just enough to see the nightmare unfolding. His amplifier system was failing. The power load on his side of the stage was unstable. One wrong surge, one overloaded circuit, and Brian's entire guitar signal would vanish on the live global broadcast. Millions were watching. Billions would eventually see the footage. And if the red special went silent, Queen's comeback moment would collapse. Brian panicked internally. He adjusted cables with his foot. He nudged the power box. He signaled subtly to a technician off stage. Nothing worked. Freddie was mid-performance, electrifying the crowd, unaware of the crisis unfolding inches behind Brian. Brian's thoughts spiraled. If my guitar dies now, I ruin everything. His hands trembled as he played. Every note could have been the last one heard. But then, Freddie did something strange. He moved toward Brian's side of the stage earlier than planned. He gestured wildly at the crowd, drawing cameras and attention away from Brian. It seemed spontaneous, Freddie improvising. But decades later, Brian would confess. Freddie had seen the danger, and he saved Brian by distracting the world long enough for the technician to reset the failing power. Freddie's brilliance on stage wasn't just musical, it was instinctive, protective, selfless. But Brian wasn't ready to admit that yet. He was too shaken, too terrified of what nearly happened. And Freddie's condition was about to hit a breaking point backstage. As the last chords of Crazy Little Thing Called Love faded, Freddie's chest heaved. His breaths were sharp, quick, strained. Roger shot him a worried glance. John frowned. Brian's stomach twisted. Then Roger tapped his sticks 4 times, signaling the start of We Will Rock You. The ground shook under the weight of 100,000 stomps. The stadium became a beating heart. Freddie powered through, not flawlessly but fiercely. His voice cracked one. Only Brian noticed, but Freddie refused to bend. Then came, We Are the Champions. Freddie approached the mic like a confession. The sun dipped low, painting him gold. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but emotion. Every lyric carried the weight of their history. The fights, the breaks, the doubt, the grief, the love. Brian played behind him, tears burning in his eyes. He knew Freddie was performing through pain, through fear, through everything. And Freddie's strength only sharpened Brian's guilt. He knew what almost happened, what Freddie saved him from, what the world would never see. The final note hit. The crowd erupted. Freddie raised his fist in triumph. And then, as soon as they stepped backstage, he nearly collapsed. Behind the stage, the roar of the crowd shook the walls. But inside the narrow Wembley corridor, Queen walked in silence. Freddie stumbled into a chair. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Roger dropped his drumsticks. John leaned against the wall, speechless. Brian stood frozen, guitar still in hand, staring at Freddie with a mixture of relief and horror. Minutes passed before anyone spoke. Finally, Freddie looked up at Brian. Weak, sweaty, exhausted, but smiling. "Did we do all right, Bree?" he whispered. Brian knelt next to him. "Freddie, you were unbelievable." Freddie chuckled softly. "You were too. Even with your little problem." Brian's blood ran cold. Freddie had noticed. The stumble. The crackle. The failing power. Freddie leaned close. "Don't worry, dear. I covered you. Couldn't have your guitar disappearing in front of half the world, could we?" Brian stared at him, stunned. Freddie winked. "That's what friends are for." And Brian later admitted, "In that moment, I realized Freddie didn't just save the show. He saved me. And I never told anyone." The band sat together quietly, absorbing what had just happened. No celebration, no applause. Just 4 men rediscovering something sacred. They still needed each other. The next day, the headlines exploded. Queen stole Live Aid. Freddie Mercury, The Resurrection. The greatest live performance ever recorded. But none of the articles mentioned the stumble, the tremor, the failing amplifier. The moment Freddie nearly collapsed backstage, the world saw perfection. Only Brian carried the truth. He watched the footage repeatedly that week. He saw Freddie's eyes shift toward him at exactly the right second. The distraction, the misdirection, the sacrifice. But Brian said nothing. Not to journalists, not to fans, not even to Roger or John. It became the weight he carried quietly, a private memory sealed behind decades of interviews and documentaries. And when Freddie called Brian a few days later, he didn't talk about pain or fear or illness. He said only, "Darling, let's get back in the studio. I've got ideas." For the first time in years, Brian felt hope. Live Aid hadn't just revived Queen's career, it had revived their soul. And though Freddie's body would soon betray him, his love for the band had never been stronger. But the full truth Brian carried, the secret he never told, was still waiting. Years later, long after Freddie was gone, long after Live Aid had become myth, Brian finally revealed the truth. The secret he'd kept hidden, the moment that haunted him. During Hammer to Fall, the power system behind Brian's amplifier had dangerously overloaded. For a few horrifying seconds, his guitar signal flickered, on the brink of total failure. If it had died, Queen's entire comeback would have crashed live in front of the world. The cameras were locked on Brian, the universe held its breath, but Freddie saw it. In the middle of singing, in the middle of commanding the largest audience of his life, Freddie changed direction. He moved across the stage earlier than planned. He waved wildly to the crowd, drawing every camera. He improvised movements, jokes, poses, funneling all attention away from Brian. He gave the backstage technician the seconds needed to restore the power. He saved the performance. He saved Queen's moment. He saved Brian from a humiliation that would have followed him for the rest of his life. And he never told a soul. Brian later whispered, "Everyone says Freddie saved Live Aid, but they don't know how true that is. He saved the show, the band, and he saved me." That was the secret I kept. In the most legendary performance in rock history, Freddie Mercury wasn't just leading the world, he was protecting the people he loved. And that is why his legacy continues to grow. Not just because he was a showman, but because he was a brother. And if Freddie's loyalty still moves you, if this story deepened your love for Queen, then tell us in the comments. Which Queen song changed your life? Like the video if Freddie's bravery still inspires you. And subscribe, because we're keeping these forgotten stories alive, one legend at a time.